Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we are diving into something absolutely crucial, a growing challenge facing democratic systems all over the world. We're going to unpack Dr. Ryan Baidya's fascinating research on how constitutions literally must adapt and protect themselves when defeated leaders just flat out refuse to concede. It's a concept that really challenges everything we assume about how political power actually transitions.
The author anchors their entire argument with this really powerful premise. Think about it for a second. The true ritual of a constitutional democracy isn't the victory parade. I mean, every ruler everywhere celebrates winning. The defining test is actually defeat. It's about whether a defeated leader concedes, whether their party permits a peaceful transfer of power, and whether constitutional institutions, not mobs, determine the final outcome. So, to make sense of this growing global threat and explore the proposed remedies, we'll be following a pretty clear roadmap today. We'll start with the true test of democracy, look at rejecting the people's mandate, examine the constitutional gap, introduce defensive democracy, look at the German model, and finally, lay out a blueprint for accountability. Let's get right into it.
All right, Section 1, the true test of democracy.
You know, the modern threat to constitutional democracies isn't just coming from military coups anymore. It's shifted. Now we're seeing elected leaders who use democratic elections to get power, but completely reject that very same system when they lose it. It's kind of like playing a board game with someone who's perfectly happy to play, but flips the whole table the second they start losing. They accept democracy when it hands them power, but reject it when it attempts to remove them, turning a standard electoral defeat into a really dangerous hostage situation.
Which brings us to Section 2, rejecting the people's mandate.
The report actually documents two major modern case studies to illustrate this problem. First, it looks at the aftermath of the 2026 West Bengal Assembly election in India. Citing Reuters and other outlets, the source notes a decisive defeat where the ruling party dropped to 80 seats. But instead of conceding, the defeated chief minister refused to resign, alleging fraud without providing any public evidence. And this rhetoric escalated incredibly fast. By May 6th, it had turned into a full-blown public order crisis, forcing the chief election commissioner to order continuous patrolling amid threats of widespread violence.
And similarly, the author points us to the United States right after the 2020 presidential election. The report notes that Donald Trump refused to accept defeat and repeatedly claimed the election was stolen. This, of course, culminated in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. The source cites the Select Committee's final report, concluding that this was actually the first time in American history that a president refused his constitutional duty to peacefully transfer power.
These events are deeply concerning, and they force us to ask a really blunt question posed by the source. Can a defeated ruling party remain in power simply by declaring the election illegitimate? Because if the answer is yes, well, your vote, the people's mandate, doesn't really matter, does it? It only counts if the defeated ruler gracefully agrees to accept it. That challenges the absolute core of democratic sovereignty.
So, why is this allowed to happen? Let's move to Section 3, the constitutional gap.
This is where things get really interesting because the author exposes what they call a constitutional gap. And there's a real irony here. On paper, both India and the US have rules against anti-democratic behavior. In India, Section 29A requires parties to pledge allegiance to democracy, but the Supreme Court ruled the Election Commission just doesn't have the broad power to deregister them if they break that pledge. Over in the US, the 14th Amendment bars insurrectionists from office, but a 2024 Supreme Court ruling found that it actually requires federal legislation to enforce. So both systems theoretically forbid the behavior, but they completely lack the immediate teeth to deter party-level sabotage.
So how do we fix this gap? That takes us to Section 4. Enter defensive democracy. Dr. Baidya proposes this fascinating document called defensive democracy. The core argument is simple but really profound. A democratic constitution is not a suicide pact. It literally doesn't have to just sit there and passively watch while political actors use democratic rights to tear the whole system down from the inside out. Yes, a democracy absolutely must protect political dissent, that's a given, but it cannot, and must not, protect organized constitutional sabotage.
Now, you might be thinking, couldn't this be abused by authoritarians? And yes, it could, which is why the text draws a very strict line here to separate the two. On one hand, you have lawful challenge, filing court petitions, seeking recounts, peacefully protesting. That is normal, healthy democracy in action. But on the other hand, you have anti-democratic defiance, refusing to vacate office, inciting violence, or declaring an entire election illegitimate without a shred of evidence. Defensive democracy is designed to exclusively target that second category of behavior.
let's see how this actually works in practice in Section 5, the German model.
What's super fascinating is that a working version of this already exists. Germany's Article 21 of their Basic Law is pretty much the gold standard here. It explicitly allows for the banning of political parties that seek to abolish the free democratic order. But the real genius is in the safeguard. The executive branch can't just casually ban a political rival. Proceedings have to be decided by the independent Federal Constitutional Court, with incredibly high evidentiary standards. It's a perfectly balanced system. It's strong enough to defend democracy, but restrained enough to prevent abuse.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 6, Blueprint for Accountability. Building on that international standard, the author outlines a specific constitutional reform for modern democracies, the doctrine of democratic forfeiture. Think of a political party like a rented car. If you use a rented car to commit a crime, the rental company takes it back, right? Similarly, if a party systematically refuses a peaceful transfer of power, it forfeits its democratic protection. Having the threat of their very legal existence on the line forces political parties to discipline their own leaders. To make this actually work fairly in practice, the author proposes a graduated scale of 6 sanctions. You don't just jump straight to the nuclear option. It starts gently with constitutional warnings and censure, then escalates to financial penalties, freezing election symbols, or disqualifying specific leaders, all the way up to suspending registration. Step 6, complete party dissolution, is the absolute final remedy, reserved strictly for the most extreme threats to the constitutional order. But absolutely crucial to this whole blueprint are the safeguards. Notice the pillars of this proposal. These tools can never, ever be wielded by a sitting president or prime minister. They require independent adjudication by a constitutional court, a super high evidentiary threshold, the strict protection of lawful dissent, and the right to an appeal. This ensures that defensive democracy actually protects the people, rather than just handing the ruling party a convenient weapon to silence ordinary opposition. We're going to wrap up this explainer with a really thought-provoking quote from the source. The people vote, constitutional institutions certify, courts review evidence, defeated governments leave office. When that discipline collapses, defensive democracy must begin. It really strips democracy down to its bare mechanics, doesn't it? What happens to our institutions when that bare minimum discipline just collapses? I'll leave you with this. If the defeated get to decide whether your vote is valid, do we even have a democracy at all?